Here is a number that did not appear in any Detroit earnings call: 70%. That is how much sales collapsed at a tool and die shop in Windsor, Ontario, just across the river from Detroit, after General Motors canceled a set of electric vehicle programs in 2025. On GM's quarterly report, that cancellation showed up as a line labeled strategic restructuring. On the books of the Canadian supplier that had spent 2 years building tooling and capacity for those exact programs, it showed up as a business in freefall. And Windsor is not an isolated case. It is the clearest stress test of what happens when American trade policy and American corporate strategy hit the same supply chain at the same time. To understand what is happening in Windsor, you need to understand what the Windsor-Detroit corridor actually is and why it cannot be replaced in any time frame that matters to the people inside it. The Ambassador Bridge connecting Windsor and Detroit is the single busiest international trade crossing in North America. More than a quarter of all Canada-US trade moves through it. The automotive supply chain that runs through this corridor is not a pipeline. It is a web. A single vehicle assembled in a Detroit area plant may contain an engine block machined in Windsor, a transmission component from an Ohio Tier 2 supplier, a seat assembly from a Monterey facility, and wiring harnesses that cross the border twice before final installation. Under the USMCA, all of those components move duty-free as long as the finished vehicle meets the agreement's rules of origin. That is the legal architecture that makes the integrated supply chain economically viable. Think of it like a factory floor split across an international border. Both sides build the same product, paid by the same supply contracts, scheduled by the same production calendars. When something disrupts one side, a tariff, a program cancellation, the disruption moves through every node in the network. It does not stop at the border. When Trump signed the Section 232 executive order imposing a 25% tariff on imported vehicles and auto parts in March 2025, the immediate legal question was which components qualified for CUSMA exemption and which did not. The Commerce Department's determination that only components with sufficient U.S.-based content qualify created an overnight compliance burden for Canadian suppliers. Brian Kingston, president of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, said publicly that the tariffs had cut profits, affected jobs, and changed investment plans across every major Canadian assembly facility. That statement was reported as industry advocacy. What Kingston was actually describing was a structural repricing of the entire cross-border production model, one that Canadian suppliers had no mechanism to absorb quickly. The Bank of Canada quantified the shift in its April 2026 report. The average U.S. tariff on Canadian goods had risen from 0.1% to 5.8% over 12 months. That may sound modest in isolation. On automotive supply chains where components cross the border multiple times, the cost compounds with each crossing. A part that crosses twice carries an effective 11.6% cumulative tariff burden before it reaches final assembly, a level that eliminates the single-digit margins the Canadian parts sector depends on. Here's where it gets really interesting. The tariff is only half the problem. The other half arrived from a completely different direction, and it is the combination of the two that is producing the 70% sales collapses that individual Windsor suppliers are now reporting. When Stellantis announced in October 2025 that it was canceling plans to build the Jeep Compass at its Brampton, Ontario assembly plant, moving production instead to an idled facility in Belvidere, Illinois, approximately 3,000 Brampton workers faced an immediate loss of long-term production certainty. Stellantis did not frame the decision as a response to tariff pressure. The company described it as a production optimization. Brian Kingston, asked about the Belvidere decision by reporters, said only that Canadian facilities needed to maintain their production footprint or risk losing future investment cycles. That framing was diplomatic. What it described was straightforward. When a U.S. administration imposes tariffs and simultaneously signals that domestic production will be rewarded, global automakers with production decisions pending will move those decisions to the rewarded geography. Stellantis moved to Belvidere, because moving to Belvedere was cheaper. The tariff made it cheaper. At the same time, General Motors was pulling back from EV programs that Canadian suppliers had already tooled and staffed to support. Narmco Group, a Windsor area supplier, took direct order losses when GM canceled specific projects, losses separate from any tariff calculation, driven instead by GM's EV strategy retreat as federal tax credits expired and consumer adoption slowed. But the timing produced a compound shock. The tariff raised the cost of cross-border business, and the EV cancellations eliminated the order volumes that had justified the investment in that capacity. A tool and die shop that spent 2 years building specialized equipment for a program that no longer exists, while watching its margins compress under a tariff it cannot pass on, has no good options. 70% is what no good options looks like on a revenue line. Unifor National President Lana Payne, speaking on the 1-year anniversary of the automotive tariffs in April 2026, was direct. The only thing liberated as a result of these crushing tariffs have been auto workers liberated from their good union jobs on both sides of the border. Her count included 3,000 Stellantis Brampton workers, 1,200 at GM's CAMI plant in Ingersoll, and thousands more across the parts sector. There is another angle that almost nobody is talking about. The disruption to Canadian automotive supply is not staying in Canada. It is arriving in American factories and American dealerships, and it is doing so through channels that are difficult to trace back to a single tariff or a single program cancellation. The Windsor-Detroit corridor's supply chain integration means that when a Canadian Tier 2 supplier reduces output because its order book collapsed 70%, the American Tier 1 assembler that depended on that supplier's components does not simply find a replacement. Specialized automotive components are not commodity goods. A tool and die shop that machines a specific suspension bracket to a tolerance of a few thousandths of an inch has years of process knowledge embedded in its operation. Finding a domestic replacement takes 12 to 18 months, minimum. During that gap, American assembly plants run with reduced flexibility, carry higher inventory costs, or delay model changeovers. All of those outcomes have costs that eventually show up in vehicle prices. RBC Economics published an analysis in May 2026, modeling 4 scenarios for the Canadian automotive sector's future. In the most optimistic scenario, one in which CUSMA is successfully renewed and tariff-free access is restored, Canadian assembly volume could reach 2 million units by 2040. In the most pessimistic scenario, one in which the CUSMA automotive provisions are weakened or stripped in the July 2026 review, RBC projected that assembly plants would begin leaving Canada, and that by 2040, the country's automotive manufacturing presence could be effectively eliminated. Kingston, reviewing the RBC scenarios publicly, said the pessimistic case was not inevitable, but not theoretical. That is the polite version of saying, if the CUSMA review fails, Windsor is not looking at a difficult decade. It is looking at the end of its primary industry. And here is something most people missed entirely. When Stellantis moved the Jeep Compass to Belvedere, Canada's Industry Minister Melanie Joly announced a notice of default on Stellantis's funding agreements. The public money the company had accepted came with performance clauses requiring Canadian production. Moving to Illinois may have violated those commitments. That legal dispute is unresolved as of May 2026, a signal that the contracts written to hold the supply chain together are now being litigated in the same environment where the supply chain is contracting. Now here is where this starts affecting people who have never heard of Windsor, Ontario, or Narmco Group. When Trump announced the 25% tariff on imported vehicles, he exempted CUSMA-compliant components. For now, that exemption is what allowed American assembly plants to keep running without an immediate price shock to consumers. But the exemption is conditional on the CUSMA framework remaining intact. The July 1, 2026 review deadline is not an abstract diplomatic event. It is the date on which the legal basis for that exemption either continues or becomes negotiable. If you bought a new vehicle in 2025 or are planning to in 2026, part of the price you paid or will pay reflects the cost that Canadian suppliers are already absorbing. When a Tier 2 Windsor shop has to cut capacity because its order book collapsed, the The Tier 1 American assembler it supplied has to find alternative sourcing at higher cost, on shorter notice with CEO, with less established process knowledge. Those costs eventually move into the sticker price. The Tax Foundation estimated in 2026 that the average American household already pays approximately $1,500 per year in additional costs attributable to the tariff regime. The automotive supply chain disruption is one of the mechanisms through which that number rises. If you work in an American automotive plant in Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, or Alabama, your production schedule depends on components that cross the border from Canada. When GM cut the third shift at its Oshawa plant and Stellantis moved the Compass to Belvidere, those decisions were covered as Canadian employment stories. They are also American supply chain stories. The specialized Canadian suppliers that built capacity for those programs do not simply pivot to serving American assemblers on a different schedule. They reduce. And when they reduce, the component availability that American plants count on gets tighter, more expensive, and more fragile. The disruption does not stop at the border. It never did. So here's the question. A tool and die shop in Windsor posts a 70% sales decline. A Brampton assembly plant loses 3,000 jobs to Belvidere, Illinois. RBC models a scenario in which Canadian automotive manufacturing is effectively eliminated by 2040. And all of this is happening 6 weeks before the CUSMA review deadline that will determine whether the legal framework holding the integrated supply chain together gets renewed, renegotiated, or allowed to erode. Some will argue this is how industrial policy works. That Belvidere gets American jobs, that tariffs incentivize domestic manufacturing, and that Windsor's disruption is an acceptable transition cost. The Belvidere workers getting those jobs would agree. Others will argue that a supply chain built over 40 years cannot be reshored in 6 weeks of negotiations, that the Canadian suppliers losing 70% of their revenue are not abstractions, and that American assembly plants will feel the component gap in their own schedules before any domestic replacement is ready. Both arguments are real. What do you think happens to the Windsor-Detroit corridor after July 1st? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to understand what this collapse looks like from the Windsor side, that full story is on our partner channel, the Canada Side.